I am a dreamer. My dreams are more real to me than reality. Here, I pass through each day in a haze, one moment blending into the next, one year blending into another. Most of my memories of the past are hazy at best, slipping through my history like a pickpocket through a crowd, grabbing hold of whatever strikes its fancy with no rhyme or reason I can discern. Faces of friends, words that were spoken, and promises broken all fade into obscurity through the passage of time. On the other hand, my dreams are striking and vivid. Each moment has meaning and importance. Every setting is a puzzle to be unraveled. Every person has a role to play. The worst part about my dreams is waking in this world again and feeling the shadows smother my reality. I find myself trudging through each day, waiting for enough time to pass that I can awaken into a world of my next dream. I will tell you of one such dream. Some may call this a nightmare, but to me it was just another living dream. In this world, the world in which I am telling you this story, I have little to no musical talent. I might hum along with a favorite song and maybe tap my feet to a rhythmic beat, but that is the extent of my abilities. However, in the reality of my dream, I was a musician of some skill. Not enough to be important or well-known, but good enough that I refused to give up on my dreams of something greater. I poured my heart and soul into my craft, and around me I slowly gathered great debts and fading relationships. But I did have this one song I was writing. If I could only finish it, I'm pretty sure I could sell it. I just needed more time to finish it. Eventually, things progressed to the point that I could no longer ignore them. I was in danger of losing my apartment and my instruments, and thus my dream. So that was why, after a particularly unsatisfying set at a low-paying gig, I actually noticed an advertisement on the grungy particle board next to my patron's bar. It simply said, "Wanted and piano tuner," and had a number to call. Needing the money, I called it. I still remember the voice that answered. It was annoyingly curt and oddly snivelly, like the person on the other end was talking through a stuffy nose. "Yes, what?" Not sure what to say, I paused a moment. Remembering the debt I owed to all the wrong people, I shook my head and spoke up. Yeah, I'm calling about an ad for a piano tuner." The voice on the other end suddenly grew warm, though no less snivelly than before. "Oh, yes, the ad. We've got a number of pianos that need tuning, and we'll pay for quality work. Think you're up to the job?" I was a bit taken aback by the sudden change in tone. I stuttered a moment as my eyes blinked while I gathered my thoughts. Well, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with tuning most instruments, pianos included, but I don't have a car, so distance may be an issue. Where's the job at?" The voice grew warmer, but it was the kind of warm that oozed insincerity and condescension. It made my skin crawl. "Oh, you've probably never heard of our village, but if you must know, it's a gated community called Fayance End. Travel is no problem, we'll send someone to pick you up. Each house has a piano, and each night you will tune one piano. We will pay you $1,000 a night plus room and board. How soon can you start?" I had been just about to turn the job down. As badly I needed the money, it wasn't worth dealing with such an arrogant rat of a man, but then he mentioned the pay. $1,000 a night? To tune just one piano each night? Did I hear you correctly? The voice was suddenly smug and satisfied. He had me and he knew it. "That's right. One piano, $1,000. So again, how soon can you start?" I bit my tongue. I'd lost more than one decently paying job by telling my bosses what I thought of them, but for $1,000 a night for so little work, I could definitely keep those thoughts to myself. Right away, I guess. Just let me go home and get a few things." The voice once more returned to its curt manner from the beginning, though it still held a bit of the self-satisfied edge that grated my bones. "Excellent. Go and get what you need. Our driver will be there shortly." The line went dead before I could tell him where I lived, and I found myself wondering how the driver was going to find me. Honestly, I don't remember much of the drive. We drove past a blur of trees, hills, and houses when I finally realized we'd been driving through a suspiciously isolated forest for some time. I think the thing that struck me most odd was how well maintained the road was. Usually, driving through back hills like this, the road would be dirt or at the very least full of potholes. But this road looked like it had been repaved recently. Even the painted lines looked fresh. I was just taking a breath to comment about the oddity of it all when I noticed we were slowing. As we turned one last corner, we came to a halt in front of some of the most enormously imposing gates I'd ever seen. They looked as though they were designed to fend off a siege of some kind. As my driver got out to approach the intercom, I couldn't help but mutter my thoughts out loud. Or maybe they're meant to keep something inside? I'd meant it as a joke, to lighten the situation a little. Instead, the words echoed around in my head, conjuring all sorts of terrible images and possibilities from my imagination. Soon, the gates shook as powerful motors drew them aside. As they withdrew into the walls, I could finally make out what lay beyond. The forest had been deep and oppressive, but before me stood a beautifully picturesque village I'd ever seen. It could have been taken out of a 1950s movie if you replaced the houses with mansions. Even with the setting sun, everything was bright and cheerful. Lawns and gardens were immaculate, and I could even hear birds singing in the distance. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but this wasn't it. I looked over to my driver, but he just stood there impassively, as though waiting for something. That was when I heard footsteps approaching through the shadows cast by the setting sun. Whoever it was certainly coming from some distance away, but they always just stayed within the slowly expanding shadows. Finally, as the sun faded from view, I could make out a man approaching. The odd thing is that as I'm writing this, I can't remember his face. I remember all the specific details. He had a long nose, thin lips, a scraggly attempt at mutton chops, and beady eyes that seemed to dart to and fro. But in my mind, the pieces of the puzzle refused to come together. They slip and slide around on his face, refusing to form any kind of coherent image. Once he was a few feet away, he came to a halt, and a familiar snivelly voice greeted me. "Welcome. Come with me. The first piano awaits." I started to protest, looking back at the car when I noticed that the driver was now gone. My guide waved away my concerns. "Do not worry. The driver will deliver your things to the place you'll be staying. While you're here, your every need will be seen to. All you have to do is tune the pianos. As I said, the first piano awaits, so please follow me." Appearing to have little choice in the matter, I complied. As we walked, my guide continued to speak, though I noticed he never bothered to make eye contact. "Your first piano will be in the house of Lord Evans." I had to stifle a laugh. Lord Evans, really? Just how full of themselves were these people? I literally bit my tongue to keep from saying anything as my guide continued. "You'll find he's one of the more down-to-earth members of our little community. I thought he would be the best job for you to start out with." I simply nodded but didn't say anything. The only things I could think to say at the moment would probably cost me this job, and I couldn't afford that. Appearing to find my acknowledgement acceptable, my guide walked the rest of the way in silence. Not having anything productive to say, I did as well. He led me into the nearest of the mansions and through several halls decked out in the gaudiest gold trim, tacky statues, and even one gallery featuring honest-to-God suits of armor. If this Lord Evans was the most down-to-earth of the lot, I'm not sure I was ready to meet the rest. Eventually, we came to a halt in a surprisingly simplistically tasteful room. The centerpiece of it all was an elegant grand piano, the kind of which was obviously worth more than I could make in a year. I looked over at my guide, but he was already turning to leave. "Well, go ahead and get to it. I'm sure Lord Evans will be down to check on your progress shortly." With that, he was gone, and I was now alone in the oppressively silent room. Not knowing what else to do, I shrugged and decided to get to work. Sitting down at the piano, I decided to give the keys a quick brush to see how out of tune this piano was. Instead of the cacophony of oscillating tones like I expected, my ears were met with only clear, crisp notes. I blinked in confusion for a moment. Maybe this Evans actually knew a thing or two about pianos and kept it relatively in tune? I was probably only there to fine-tune it beyond what he was capable of. Bending closer and angling my ear to hear even the tiniest discrepancies, I struck a single key. The note came back as pure and clean as any I'd ever heard. Working my way up and down the keyboard, every note was the same. This piano was expertly tuned, and far better than I could manage. I was just sitting back and looking at the piano in confusion when I heard my guide's footsteps return. Without taking my eyes off the puzzle in front of me, I spoke. "There must be some mistake. This piano is already perfectly tuned." I nearly jumped out of my skin when the voice responded was rich with warmth and mirth, unlike the snivelly tone I'd been expecting. "Oh, excellent. I've been practicing my hand at piano tuning. I'm glad to hear my hard work has paid off." And turning around, I was met by a jolly, overweight man with a full head of hair and an even fuller beard. I'm reasonably sure he could have passed for anyone's generic grandfather, if he'd not been wearing a business suit that looked as though it had cost something upwards of 10 grand merely to stitch together. I stuttered a moment before finding my words. "Oh, you must be Lord Evans. I'm sorry, I was expecting, someone else." Evans smiled. "Oh, don't worry about it. All these empty halls can play tricks on the ear." Not sure what else to say, I started rubbing the back of my neck absent-mindedly. "Well, I'm sorry to say I won't be of much help to you here. This piano was already tuned as well as I could manage, if not better, I guess." I didn't want to say the next part. "I guess you don't have to pay me tonight." Evans smiled delightedly, even as he waved away my concerns. "Nonsense. You came all the way out here at our request. You must be paid. If it's a matter of pride, I can respect that. So what say we come to a different agreement?" I didn't like where this was going. "What kind of agreement?" Evans smiled again. It was an amiable smile, one I'd seen on 100 faces 100 times. But for some reason, his face, it seemed a little off. "Oh, nothing too demanding, I assure you. You see, in addition to being a bit of an amateur piano tuner, I'm also a bit of an amateur composer. I've written a song for the piano that I'm convinced would be splendid to listen to, but I'm afraid it's just a little beyond my ability to play. If you play the song for me, we can call that services rendered, and you'll be paid in full." Feeling like the other shoe had yet to drop, I cautiously agreed. "All right, I suppose that would be fine. Where's the song you'd like me to play?" Evans nodded at the piano behind me. "Why, it's already set up, ready to go." Turning my back around to face the piano, I could see he was right. I didn't remember the sheet music being there before, but maybe I'd just been so focused on the tuning that it escaped my notice. Stepping closer to get a better look, I noticed the sheet was odd. It was as though it was constantly shifting and moving. Any note I focused on froze in place, but all the rest seemed to be in a constant flux. It made my head hurt just to look at it. Turning back to Evans with my confusion probably evident, I couldn't help but express my doubts. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think I'm good enough to play this either. Something about this song is..." Evans cut me off. "Oh, don't worry about it. I'm not expecting you to play it perfectly. Just take it one note at a time and see how it sounds. If it's a matter of money, I'll even double your pay for the night." $2,000 just to play one song? It didn't matter how weird this place was or how big a headache I got looking at the music. I was going to give it my best shot. I sat down and focused my attention on the first note, freezing it in place under my scrutiny. Upon striking the key, the following note froze as well. Then another, and another. Soon I was playing the single most beautiful piece of music I'd ever heard. As I write this, the song has completely faded from my memory. I can't so much as hum a single bar. What I do remember is what I felt as I played. This song was the very essence of sadness and loss. I could feel tears running freely down my face as I fell into the song. The music spoke to me of lost loves, faded dreams, forgotten summers, and more. Even when I closed my eyes, the music continued to come to me unbidden, and my fingers danced the keys of the piano as though I'd known the song my entire life. I have no idea how long I played, but eventually, my trance was broken by the light of the rising sun shining through the window. My fingers ached, my back was sore, and I felt like I was dying of hunger and thirst, but I didn't care. Playing that song had been the single greatest moment of my life. If I died right then, I could die happy. Judging by the look on Lord Evans' face, he agreed. With a nod of his head, he held out the promised money. $2,000. I took it without saying a word and turned to leave the same way I'd come in. As I walked through the halls I'd walked through before, everything passed in a blur. None of that mattered. Instead, I was trying desperately to hold on to the song that was already fading from my memory. But as soon as I set foot outside the mansion, the music was gone forever. Try as I might, I couldn't remember a single note to add to my song. The next night, I found myself following my guide once again. This time, he led me to a mansion with deep red curtains, beautifully carved masonry, and even a sizable, ornate fountain as a centerpiece out in front of the main entrance. It was so stereotypical of something I might expect a mansion to look like as a kid, I had to bite my tongue once again. After the silence of our walk, I jumped a bit when my guide's voice cut into my thoughts. "This is the home of Lady Scarlet. She's a bit more aggressive than your first client, but as long as you fulfill your role, she'll leave you be. Just be sure to mind your manners." Walking into the mansion, I could see the room was adorned in red, from the carpet to drapery. I thought that Lady Scarlet might be a little too on the nose, but remembering my guide's warning, I kept that thought to myself. I wasn't sure when my guide left my side, but it didn't seem to matter because there was the piano I was here to tune right in the middle of the room. It was a lithe but elegant piece, made from cherry wood with gold leaf highlights and polished to perfection. Sitting down, I couldn't help but grow suspicious. With a slight frown, I tested my suspicion by striking a key. As I'd expected, the sound that rang out was crystal clear. This piano was also tuned to perfection. This time, I was expecting the voice that purred out of the darkness behind me. She does have a lovely voice, doesn't she? Turning around, I saw a woman who could only be Lady Scarlet. She was dressed in a sleek, form-fitting gown, red of course, accented by red gloves and a red hat. It would have been far too much red on anyone but her, but somehow she pulled it off. As she approached me, I couldn't help but notice she moved with unearthly grace, undulating like a snake slipping across the floor. Even her eyes were those of a predator, and I was definitely the prey. She stopped short and shifted her attention from me to the piano. "So, why aren't you tending to her needs?" I suppose Lady Scarlet should have been attractive. Certainly, she fit all the criteria. But when her attention shifted back from the piano to me again, I couldn't help but wish she'd rest her gaze on anywhere else other than myself. It was starting to seem like everything about this place was off just by the slightest margins, and it was really starting to unsettle me, and more as time went on. Taking a deep breath, I decided to answer her, if only to break the uncomfortable silence that came with her stare. Well, it seems your piano has already been tuned. I'm afraid there's not much I can do here." Lady Scarlet's eyes flashed, and in them, I saw the promise of violence. "So you just came here to waste my time?" Remembering my guide's final warning, I tried again, this time with better manners. "I apologize, Lady Scarlet, but this piano is beyond my ability to tune. If I tried, I'm afraid I could only make it worse. Since I was unable to help you this evening, you don't need to worry about the fee." She laughed derisively. "Do I look like your fee is of any consequence to myself? My time is far more valuable than that of paltry money. In return for wasting my time, I demand a service out of you." I quickly realized where this was going. Turning around, I saw some sheet music waiting for me on the piano. Just like before, it hurt to look at, though this time, the hand that scrawled the notes was obviously more aggressive than before. The notes were sharply written, almost jagged in form. The pace was sharp and rapid. At a glance, it looked like the song could only be a bundle of incoherent noise, but then I struck the first chord. Just like before, I quickly fell into the music as I played it. And just like before, all I remember are the thoughts and impressions I had of the music. This song was angry and violent. It voicelessly sang to me of scorned love, betrayal, revenge, and murder. I remember thinking at one point that my fingers must have blistered and broken because it felt like the keys were soaked in blood, but I didn't dare to look. Instead, I lost myself in the music again. I could feel my heartbeat tied to the tempo of the song. During the violent climax, I experienced a surge of adrenaline and felt my face twist into a gleeful snarl of hate. At the conclusion, my heartbeat slowed, and the adrenaline faded, but the hatred remained. It became a cold vice that wrapped itself around my heart, and I knew that same violence would only ever be a heartbeat away. The feeling only passed when the rays of the rising sun once again pierced through my window, and I once again felt myself break from whatever trance the music had placed me in. To my relief, when I turned around this time, the client wasn't there. Instead, there was an envelope with my pay inside. I picked it up and left the mansion as quickly as possible without breaking into a run. After all, a predator like that was more likely to give chase if I did. I barely thought about the fact that I forgot the music again. Each night passed much the same. My guide would take me to another mansion with a perfectly tuned piano and a host who seemed just a little off. I would play a piece of powerful music until dawn. Then I'd get paid and leave. The most maddening thing was that no matter how hard I tried, I could never remember a single song once I set foot outside the mansion. I'm not sure how long things went on like this. Maybe it would have gone on forever. Certainly, there seemed to be no end of mansions in sight. Then one morning, everything changed. As I was leaving a mansion owned by a man who was friendly in all the wrong ways, a voice called out to me. This voice sounded almost like someone was vomiting out the words rather than speaking them. Turning to see who called out, I saw something I hadn't ever expected to see in this place. Standing before me was a homeless man, one who'd obviously gotten where he was through hard living and bad decisions. His teeth were rotten, his breath smelled of death, and the stains on his coat spoke of violence and worse. I shook my head. This place must be getting to me. I wasn't the type to look down on someone just because they'd had a run of bad luck. Hell, I'd almost gone down that road myself before I found this job. Given my current financial well-being, the least I could do was spare a bit of my time and money to help this man get a bit of food in his stomach, or even just forget about his problems for a while, if he spent the money in a different way. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out some cash and held it out. I didn't look too close at how much I grabbed, but it was probably close to 100, give or take. The vagabond gave me a smile that sent shivers up and down my spine before batting my hand away. When he spoke, I was almost too distracted by holding my breath to pay attention to his words. I'm not asking you for help, kid. I'm offering you mine. Doesn't this job seem a little too good to be true? Doesn't something seem off about this place? I blinked a few times as I considered his words. He was right. Something definitely did seem off about this place and its people. Why have I never heard of a place this outlandish so near my home? Seeing the gears in my head start to turn, the man smiled, and I could clearly see his bleeding gums. Tell me, what have you actually done with all that money they've been giving you? When was the last time you actually went to the free room they offered you? When was the last time you remember sleeping? His words were absurd. Of course I had been back to my room to sleep. That's where I'd been headed when he interrupted me, after all. What else would I do during the day while I waited for my next job? That was when I noticed it wasn't day any longer. At some point the sun had set again and it was night once more. I blinked stupidly as I tried to understand what was happening when he spoke again. Well, maybe you've just been going from one job to the next without end. Constantly playing strange music, and feeling like you're just a little more exhausted each time. I was exhausted, but I tried to tell myself that it was just because of how hard I'd been working. But that didn't explain why I couldn't remember ever going to my room. It didn't explain why everything in this place seemed to be so close to normal but so off-putting. The man shook his head as if I was a particularly dim-witted student. This village is old, far older than you realize, and the people in it are even older still. They each sold their souls to some various gods, demons, or devils in return for money, power, and longevity. But those gifts ain't free. You see, their patrons require payment for their services. That payment is made in souls. I laughed. It was meant to be dismissive laughter. This man had obviously gone insane and was spewing nonsense. But the laughter that left my mouth started out a little unsettled before slowly shifting to the laughter of a doomed man hiding behind his own delusions in the face of the nightmare his life was becoming. The drifter laughed with me. You're kidding now. You're nothing more than some stupid beast being led to the slaughter. The best part is, it no longer matters. You can't do anything to save yourself. From the moment you played the first note of that first song, your fate was sealed, and your soul is no longer your own. He waited a moment while I caught my breath, then shifted from idiotic laughter to stoic placidity in the blink of an eye. But there still is one thing you can do. Just like that, he held my attention once again. I thought you said I couldn't save myself. He grinned, but this wasn't the mad grin from before. It was still insane, but for the second time since arriving here, I felt like I was looking into the eyes of a predator. You can't, but you can take him with you. As old and powerful as these people are, and as old and powerful as the gods they worship are, there are still things beyond the scope of their understanding. Things that existed before reality as we know had form. Things that cannot be named or understood. They offer no gifts, but a death so complete, even your soul won't escape. If you call them here, well, at least you'll know you won't die alone. As he spoke, his words tore at my soul. I knew everything he said was true. I can't explain it or even understand it, but at that moment, he and I existed at the same place at the same time, and I would feel the certainty and honesty of his words. Stepping back into myself, I shook my head. How do I call them? He smiled again, though this time his mouth was suddenly full of unnervingly sharp teeth. How else? You play their song. He reached out and placed a crumpled ball of paper in my hands. It was so rumpled, stained, and torn that I was sure it must have been useless. But before I could say anything, the man was gone, and I could hear footsteps behind me. I pocketed the paper before turning around. There, moving at a rushed pace for the first time I could remember, was my guide. He seemed relieved to have found me. There you are. I've been looking all over. You're late for your next job. Now hurry. I debated asking questions or just saying screw this and walking away, but before I could choose either, my guide grabbed me by the wrist and started walking away. His grip was so tight it felt like my arm was in danger of having its bones crushed. So rather than fight, I started following. I could hear his snivelly voice droning on about something as we walked. He was probably telling me about the next mansion and its host, but I couldn't focus enough to make any sense out of it. Instead, my mind was replaying all the things the vagabond had told me. Over the last week, things like long, spacious halls filled to the brim with priceless artifacts had stopped impressing me. It was the norm here, and I honestly couldn't care less what gold leaf trim this particular host chose for hall. One vase caught my eye, though. As I looked at it, I wondered if it had been genuinely priceless or if a price had been paid. How much of a soul did this vase cost? Or did souls vary in worth? Was the soul of a good man worth more than another? Or maybe it was their futures that determined their worth. Perhaps the future of a med student who would have gone on to cure cancer was savored like a fine wine. I shook my head. I was approaching the piano now. My guide had already left my side, and my host had yet to show their face. I didn't bother to check the piano. I already knew it was going to be in perfect tune. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled paper the mad vagabond handed me earlier. As I looked at the paper, I hesitated. Even folded in this manner, it seemed to ooze malevolence. Honestly, my hand felt filthy just by virtue of physical contact. This paper was wrong. The deepest, most primitive parts of my brain knew that this thing was blasphemy to all of creation. The thing in my hands couldn't exist, and if I so much as acknowledged it, I would already be giving it far more power than any sane man would. Slowly, I pulled at the corners of the thing, straightening it into something that vaguely resembled the outline of a sheet of music. I say outline because I couldn't focus on the actual paper. My eyes kept slipping from one side to the other, refusing to rest on what lay between the borders of the page. I placed the paper on the music desk. It was harder to do than I thought it would be. The piano seemed to shy away from the sheet as I pushed it forward. I could hear the wood of the piano creaking and groaning as it twisted and pulled away from the blasphemy I was forcing on it. I focused my eyes on the notes. At first, all I saw was void. Then, a twisted parody of my face came into focus. The face laughed, cried, and gnashed its teeth before fading from view, leaving the notes where my haunted, sunken eyes had been. The notes hurt to look at. Not like the notes from the previous music sheets, these hurt because they did not exist, nor did anything around them. The notes were holes in reality, glimpses into the chaos hidden by the lie of order. I felt myself crying, but after wiping my face, my hands came away bloody. I raised my hands, the weight of all reality pushed down, trying to prevent what was happening. The screams of everyone, past, present, and never to come, echoed through the hall, begging me to stop, asking if my soul demanded such a high price that all of reality must pay its debt. I hesitated. This was that point. The point of no return. If I went any further, I was condemning everything and everyone to a reality without time, sanity, or existence. In its place would burn an inferno of chaos and ever-living death. Did I really want to do this? Then the door opposite the piano slammed open. There, looking down at me, was the most ostentatious peacock of a man I'd ever witnessed. He glared at me with fury plain on his face. "Who are you? You're not fit to stain my mansion with your filth. You are a blight in my eyes that must be removed. Begone! My sacrifice is coming, and this room must be pristine for his performance." I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Well, it was more of a giggle, really. A high-pitched, jaggedly twitter of a sound that had no sanity or mirth behind it. I could feel my tears begin to fall again, staining the piano with my life. My host's face contorted with disgust. "What is wrong with you, man? This isn't some charity or hospital for you to defile with your presence." He came stomping around, only to freeze in place when he saw the sheet music befouling his piano. "Where did you get that? Do you know what that is? What it could do?" I smiled, though I could feel the smile twisting farther than my lips could follow as I responded. "It's the answer, the truth. It is the unholy, holy reality of all things. If I play this music, all your little empires will crumble to dust, and you will join me in filth, burning and screaming forever. All the little teeth will dance across your bones. It will open your eyes, and we will all finally awaken." As I spoke, I could see his disgust turn to fear, then terror. He reached out to slap me. I didn't feel the impact. He grabbed my arms and tried to pull me away, but I'd just resisted everything all of reality could bring to bear, and he was no more successful than it had been. He reached for the music but stopped. As he sat there, I knew he was hearing them. The voices. I don't know when they started chittering in my ear. Maybe it was a moment ago when I'd been about to play the music. Or perhaps it was back when I'd met the vagrant. That wasn't right. Maybe they'd been here in this village the whole time. No, these voices had always been here, with me, chittering and chatting away, day in and day out, feeding me madness and feeding off of my pain. The madness. What was it they fed me? I lost it when I gave it to that boy who never was. Looking at the music again, I recognized it. This was the music I'd written my whole life. Always scribbling and scrawling away. Each and every note was written in my own hand. Even now, I could see myself in the past, absently scrawling on a sheet while I worried about the bills I had to pay. Looking down, I realized I was wearing the vagabond's coat. When had I taken his coat? Wait, no, it wasn't his coat, it was my coat. The coat I was going to wear in the future that will never happen when I give myself the music that doesn't exist. I twisted my head to look at the man frozen in fear. My head was bent in the most horrendously impossible way as I gifted him with the most comforting smile of hunger I could offer. Such a lovely peacock you'll make, cooked and set neatly next to the pheasant. I wonder how your soul will taste to mine, as we are both devoured in the mind of the sleeper that wakes. For some reason, my words of comfort seemed to upset the poor young man. As I slammed my hand down to play the first note, he ran screaming into the night. The notes and chords rent the air, and desperate cries began to fill the streets. My laughter joined the music, and I knew that I had written it in from the beginning, each vocal expulsion playing in perfect harmony with the chorus. Soon the screams, begging, and crying in the streets joined in as well. The pleasant color of warm, cheerful fires in the street accented the blood-stained windows, bathing the room in the most beautiful red light. I'm sure Lady Scarlet would have approved if her soul wasn't currently being torn into savory strips to be devoured at leisure. I laughed, played, and cried. My tears joined the blood of my fingers on the sticky keys as the furious beauty of my music tore me to pieces. But still I played on. My laughter gave out as my vocal cords were pulled from my throat, but still I played. The world was burning. I was burning. The sleeper was awakening, but still I played on. I would play on forever. I would play on until the end. I would play on until... After that, my dream ended, and I awoke to this world once again. This dull, gray, lifeless world. The world in which I tell my stories. The stories that were once told to me. I hear the stories from the voices. The chittering and chatting voices that are always with me, telling me dreams to write down. I'm always writing this story, scribbling and scrabbling away. But my story is almost finished. And soon, I will awaken. Perhaps this is the first town they visited. Maybe the last. Either way, the gods walk among us once more. All they ask for is a glance, and then they grant you bliss, ecstasy, eternity, and devotion, followed by oblivion. I live out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing. Well, that might be an exaggeration. There are a few houses, the bar where I worked, a gas station, and in the middle of town where Main Street crosses Pine, there's even a stoplight. I'm not sure what the population was, but it's down to one now. Well, one human anyway. The gods are still here. Every night they come to visit me. They offer an end to pain and suffering. They promise I'll never feel alone again. They swear to love and devote everything to me. All I have to do is look. And I want to. I want to look so bad. Maybe it won't be that bad. Maybe it'll be worth it. But first I figured I'd get the message out. This may be a warning or an offer. I suppose that's up to you to decide. It all started a few weeks ago. Or maybe it was months? I don't know. One day seems to bleed into the next now. I'm not even certain time is passing at all anymore. Whenever it was, John was the first to discover the old gods. Honestly, at first, I thought he was just screwing around. We all did. John was always the type to take a practical joke too far. So, when he came over for poker night, saying things like, "Hey guys, the gods have returned. It's amazing. You have to come check it out." No one took him seriously. Honestly, why should we? It didn't even sound like one of his more clever jokes. So, when he went around asking a bunch of us to come check it out, no one listened. But I did notice the tips of the fingers on his left hand were stained oddly. They were white, like he dipped them in something. I figured that would be the last I'd hear about it. But only a day or so later, another of our friends, Rob, started saying the same thing. "The gods have returned. John was right. This is something you all have to see." I stopped him and asked what in the hell he was talking about. But he just gripped my shoulder and smiled like some born-again nutjob. "Dude, I'm serious. John was right. The gods have returned. But he didn't mention how beautiful they are. It's something you have to see to believe." I rolled my eyes. "Come on, man. I don't know what you're going on about, but I don't have the time for this right now. Go bother someone else with this stuff. I got work in the morning." Rob just shrugged. "Your loss, but don't worry, they aren't going anywhere. The gods are nothing if not patient. They just need a little more strength, then they'll come to visit and you'll see." As I walked away, I just shook my head, wondering if they'd joined some new cult or something. I also remember seeing that the tips of Rob's fingers were also stained white, just like John's had been. It didn't take long. Soon, more and more people were talking about the gods' return, and every one of them was trying their hardest to get their friends and family to come see. Understandably, a bunch of us were kind of put out about it, to put it mildly. John seemed to be the leader of this new cult. He'd hold gatherings, trying to recruit people to come see the returned gods. And whenever someone went, they came back talking about the gods like all the rest. I didn't really speak to him or Rob anymore. I didn't really know what was happening, and I didn't want to know. The whole thing felt wrong. That, more or less, was the lead up to the night that changed everything. I was working at the bar, late of course. Since this whole thing started, there were a lot fewer people coming in, but those that did drank all the more, so I wasn't really hurting in the cash department. But all the conversations seemed pretty much the same. People talking about how they'd lost friends or family to this new cult. Even the town priest, Father Timble, was sitting in the corner. He was drunk, ranting and raving to anyone who listened. "They're all going to hell if they don't repent. Every last one. They and their false idols will burn forever." He was working up to something, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be there when he figured out what it was. I was just debating whether I should try to tell Dave, the bouncer, to kick the priest out when the door opened, and then walk John. For the record, he wasn't quite what you expected in a cult leader. He wore blue jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow. But he did have that same self-contented smile he always wore these days that made you want to punch him in the face. And it looked like a few of our patrons were getting up to do just that. I gave Dave a look, and the big man nodded and stood up to take care of things. But John held up his hands in surrender. "Relax, I'm not here to start trouble with anyone. I just thought that those of you who were unable or unwilling to come see the gods would like to know that they've come to us instead. They're outside right now. All you have to do is look for yourself and you'll see what all the commotion is about." The first to look was Dave, probably because he was already heading in that direction. Pretty soon, the big man was pressed up against the glass like a kid looking into a shop window on Christmas Eve. The drunks, ready to pick a fight, were next and soon found themselves pressed up against the window as well. Soon, all the skeptics were craning their heads to get a look. And shortly after that, they were all but climbing over each other to get a better look out the window. Even Father Timble was there, in the middle of everything. He was still shouting, but his tone had changed, and he sounded like he was giving a Sunday sermon. "Praise be the gods! They've graced us with their presence! Blessed are us who have been granted this gift! Praise be the gods!" Luckily for me, from where I was standing, I didn't have a great view of the window, so I couldn't see whatever it was everyone was going on about. After everyone started going nuts, I got this uncomfortable feeling and backed away. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I started drinking our stock and things got fuzzy. But I remember staying the hell away from the window. I heard someone rush outside. I think it was Father Timble, but I'm not sure. The only other thing I clearly remember that night was what I saw when John raised his hands. His entire left hand and arm were white like marble, except for his fingertips, which were starting to crack and peel like they were rotting away. When I finally woke up the next day, I wanted to die. Not just because sleeping on the bar floor combined with my hangover made me wish the apocalypse happened, but also because everyone in town was walking around with expressions of pure bliss, talking about how excited they were about the return of the gods, and how blessed we all were. I noticed a large ash pile in front of the bar. Some idiot had probably started a fire in the street or something, but I didn't care enough to do anything about it, and just locked up shop so I could head home. It seemed like everyone I passed had white fingertips on their left hand. I stopped by the gas station to pick up some breakfast, but despite being wide open, no one was manning the counter. It was like someone walked out in the middle of the night and left everything like it was, not wanting to be a thief but not knowing what to do. I grabbed some food, threw some money on the counter, and went home, climbing up to the third story of the apartment I lived in. I'm not sure how long after that I got a phone call. At a glance, I could see it was Mike, one of my other friends who knew John. I debated letting it ring, but decided I had to give him a chance. If he said anything about worshiping the gods, though, I was going to hang up. When I finally answered, Mike seemed kinda on edge. Not that I blamed him. "Oh, thank God you answered. Just tell me you're not one of those cultists now, are you?" I almost shook my head as I answered, but still, my pounding headache changed my mind. "No, I'm not some drooling maniac, though it seems like there's a few more of those now." Mike seemed relieved. "Yeah, there's a lot more of those. Listen, it looks like the town's been overrun, but Sam and I have a plan." I didn't like the sound of that. Mike and Sam were good enough guys, but they were also not what I would call the best planners. They were more of a dive in and figure out as you go kind of duo. But I wanted to hear what he had to say, so I let him continue. "Listen, man, just come over to our house before nightfall. I think it's time we did something about these gods. Just bring some beer." I agreed, not like I had much to lose at this point, and hung up. Around 6 in the evening, I knocked on the door, beer in hand, and Mike answered. The dude was geared up in camo like some sort of overweight commando who knew more about World of Warcraft than urban camouflage. Not that I was any expert, but something told me different shades of green wouldn't help him hide inside his beige house. I looked around, expecting to see Sam in a similar getup, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked back at Mike. "So, what's the plan? We cover ourselves in mud to hide from their heat vision?" Mike looked surprised. "No, why? Do they have heat vision?" I shook my head. "No, I was just... It doesn't matter. So, what's the plan?" Mike motioned me inside, then walked over to an open window, where he had an old rifle against the wall. "Listen, Sam and I were talking, and we think whatever it is they do to change people is kind of like Medusa. You know, from Greek history. You look them in the eye, and you get turned. Well, the way I see it, they can't look at both of us at the same time if we're on the opposite sides of the street, so Sam is just across the way. When one of them comes down the street, we'll both take a shot, and one of us will get them for sure. I shook my head. You mean Greek mythology? Oh, wait, isn't crossing your fire lines, or whatever they're called, toward each other a bad thing? What if you was going to get shot? Mike shook his head. We're not that stupid. We're not going to wait until they're right between us. We'll take our shot when they're still down the street a bit. Firing a couple of rifles in a residential area sounded stupid, but honestly, I didn't care all that much anymore. So, why am I here? Mike looked at the beer in my hands. Because of that! If we're going to be staking out the neighborhood, I figured we'd need something to drink and someone to talk to. That figured. Mike picked up a two-way radio he had next to the window. Hey, Sam, beer's here. Come get some. Long story short, the first part of the night went about how you'd expect. Lots of drinking and bullshitting in a dark room so the light wouldn't alert anyone or spoil Mike's aim. I had my back to the wall with the window to resist the temptation to look, and was feeling a nice buzz. Nothing too serious, when Sam's voice came out over the radio. Hey, Mike, I see some shadows moving our way down the street. Duck down and we'll pop up on the count of 5 and fire, all right? Mike ducked down. 10-4. I shook my head. What? Were we in Smokey and the Bandit now? Still, I couldn't help but feel just a tiny bit of hope. Maybe this could work. Sam started the count. 1. I took another sip of my beer, doing my best not to look up and out the window. 2. Mike had a grip on his gun and a determined look in his eye. 3. I put down my beer. It felt like my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. 4. This was it. 5. Mike stood up and started lifting his gun, then stopped. I was hoping to hear a rifle shot ring out from the other side, but all I heard was Mike say, "Oh, and watched as he put down his gun. Looking up at him, I was afraid he was already gone, but I had to ask anyway. What's going on? What do you see? Mike just looked down at me. Oh yeah, nothing much. Listen, I'm gonna check something out quick. I'll be right back. I shook my head. No, man, are you crazy? Stay here. You don't want to go out there. Mike just grinned that same stupid grin John always had these days. Nah, man, it'll be fine. I'm just gonna... I'll be right back. And then he walked out. I sat with my back to the window, listening for everything I was worth. But, try as I might, I couldn't make out anything that didn't sound like any other night in the middle of nowhere. My heart pounded as 1 minute bled into 2, then 3. My mind was screaming at me to stand up and look out the window to try and see what was going on. But I just sat there and refused to move. I'm not sure how long I sat there alone in the dark. If I had to guess, I'd say it was more than a half hour, but less than an hour. Eventually, the fear gave way to boredom, and I finally reached out for my beer. As my fingers touched the can, a voice spoke to me from the open window over my head. It sounded like it was inches away. I felt like I could reach out and touch it. Hello? I think my heart actually missed a beat or two, as my fear level went from 2 to 10 in a split second. A part of my mind imagined I could feel their breath as they spoke again. It sounded warm and welcoming, almost loving. A piece of my mind pictured a beautiful woman in a gorgeous red dress. But the other part imagined a desiccated mummy with a fox skull where its head should be. No need to worry yourself. We don't bite. Why don't you turn around and take a look? We promise you'll feel better if you do. I didn't know what to say or even what to think. So instead, I held my breath and willed my heart to stop beating so loud. After a moment, the voice returned. Still not willing to look? That's okay. We're patient. Take your time and look when you're ready. Then you'll realize how silly these fears of yours really are. I sat there the rest of the night, frozen in fear. I must have passed out at some point because I was awoken by light streaming through the window. With a start, I hopped to my feet and ran to the door. Mike kept his keys on a shelf next to it, and I grabbed those before pulling the door open. As I stepped out onto the walkway, I noticed a pile of white ash not far from the door. I had a sneaking suspicion that that was what was left of Mike. Across the road, in front of the other door, was another pile. In fact, looking down the street, there were several. Ignoring the implications, I ran to Mike's car, got in, and turned the ignition. Nothing. Not even the sound of the engine trying to turn over. A few more attempts ended the same. I got out and walked around the front of the car, but it seemed fine. I popped the hood, and while I'm no mechanic, everything seemed to be in place. Giving up on this car, I headed across the street, stepped over the ash pile, and tried Sam's door. It was unlocked. I found his keys on the hook he had next to his front door, but his car yielded the same result. Not sure what to do, I headed home. Some people were walking down the street, all wearing dreamy smiles like they'd had the night of their lives. But there were a lot less than the day before. I ignored them. I fumbled for my keys at the front door, only to realize that it was unlocked. I walked in cautiously, unsure what to expect, and found John waiting for me in the living room. He nodded to me. "Hey man, what's up?" I glared at him momentarily, unsure what to say, so he continued. "Listen man, I know this all seems weird and all, but trust me, everything's gonna be okay." I looked at his left hand, or rather, where it should have been. There was nothing there. "That doesn't look okay." John held up his handless arm. "Oh, this is nothing. Practically a paper cut in comparison to what I've been given. Listen, I just want you to know, no one will force your hand. The gods have told me you're to be left alone. You can join them when you're good and ready. No one will trouble you until then. Everything's gonna be okay." I just looked at him incomprehensibly for a moment before feeling a surge of rage. "Everything is gonna be okay? Everything's gonna be okay? Do you know what's happening out there every night? People are dying. Mike is gone. Sam is gone. They were your friends, and they're gone." John nodded with that same satisfied smile on his face. "I know, and I envy them. How wonderful it must be to be one with the gods." I couldn't help it. Whatever reason I possessed was gone in a flash. I stepped forward and punched John in the head as hard as I could. He didn't even try to resist. When he fell, his left arm slammed into the ground and crumbled. Out of his sleeve poured a small pile of ash. That brought my rage to an end, leaving me with something between pity and disgust as John held up his other hand in surrender. All right, I'll leave. You won't have to worry about me bothering you anymore. And tonight the gods will accept me and let me know the joy of their embrace. But you'll still be here all alone. I wonder how long you'll make them wait. I wonder how long you'll punish yourself." I debated kicking him in the head as he got up, but decided I'd rather not give myself more of a mess to clean up. After he left, I realized how exhausted I was. I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Instead, I went to bed and slept. I don't know how long I slept, but the room was dark when I awoke. A moment later, there was a tapping at my window. I was groggy enough that I almost turned and looked but stopped myself. After a moment, the tapping repeated itself, but rather than look, I just threw the covers over my head and went back to sleep. The next day, when I went out into the street. It was like the whole place was abandoned, though there were piles of ash all over the place. For a moment, I wondered which one was John, but then shrugged and decided to go get some food. Over the course of the day, I wandered around. Every house and business in the town was unlocked and open, so there was no shortage of food or drink for me, but none of the cars worked, and I was too far away from the next town to reach it on foot. I wandered around during the day for the next week or two, doing whatever I could to pass the time. And then at night, I went back home and slept in my bed. Every night, I'd be awoken by someone tapping at my window, and every night I ignored it. After a while, I tried sleeping in different people's houses. I mean, why not? It wasn't like anyone was there to object. But every night, the tapping sound found me. Finally, out of boredom one night, or maybe out of a need to socialize with someone or something, I returned home. That night, I left my window open and sat with my back to the night, my head just above the windowsill. Not long after dark, the voice from before returned. "Hello again." Surprisingly, I didn't jump out of my skin. I'd thought through 1,000 questions I was going to ask, but none of them came to mind at that moment. All I could think to ask was, "What are you?" I'd expected anger or annoyance, maybe even for whatever it was to sound insulted, but instead, it spoke to me calmly and kindly, like a teacher talking with a favorite student. "That is a complicated question, but I suppose a simpler one would be, what are we to you?" I shook my head. "Okay, then what are you to me?" I could hear a smile in the voice, like it was happy just to speak to me. "We're your friends. We want to make you happy, to give you everything you've ever wanted. We are the ones who care about you more than anyone ever did or could. We want to serve you, to worship you. All we ask is that you look at us." I laughed darkly. "Yeah, and have me turn to ash just like the rest of town? Admit it. You want to feed off of me, just like you did everyone else." Surprisingly, the voice sounded almost sad. "We must feed, yes. That is our nature, just as it is yours. But we do not take without offering something in return. Before your final moment, you will be frozen in an eternity of bliss. We will live countless lifetimes together. Throughout them, you will know no pain or sorrow. You will never be alone. We will be there with you, always and forever, as your friend, your guide, and, if you wish, your lover." At that last word, I sensed a hand reach through the window and felt a single finger caress my neck. A part of me wanted to look. It screamed at me to look. But I resisted. Instead, I started to laugh. I laughed for a while until my throat was sore, and I was desperately trying to catch my breath. Once it stopped, the room was filled with nothing but silence. Finally, I spoke again. And what if I refuse? What if, instead, I walk downstairs and slit my throat? What will you do then? The voice sounded disappointed, almost sad. "We will go hungry, and you will die alone and in pain." I shook my head. "I think I've had enough of this tonight. Just leave, okay?" This time, the voice sounded pleasant again, or friendly even. "As you wish. But we will return to speak again. Good night, our beloved." And then I was alone. After a while, I gave in to despair and looked up and out the window, but they'd been true to their word and left. I don't know why they gave me this option and no one else. Maybe they're just savoring their dessert after a feast. Or maybe I'm more like an after-dinner mint. But whatever it was, they honored their word and returned the next night, and the next, and so on. We've talked many times. I even look forward to speaking with them now. Sometimes we laugh and joke like old friends. Other times they patiently listen to me cry and rage, but they never complain. I'm pretty sure I've got something like Stockholm Syndrome at this point. Anyway, I decided to sit down and write this out. I don't know. Maybe someone will read this and do something with it. Or maybe not. Maybe you're all already dead, and I'm the last person on Earth. I don't know. But I feel like I'm losing my will to fight. Maybe I'll look tonight and see what all the fuss is about. I hear them tapping at my window, so I'll just post this and go. Don't worry about me. Whatever happens, I'm sure I won't be alone. Ever again. Heather woke with a sound trapped in her throat and a wet sheet clinging to her back. The ceiling fan clicked once every rotation, a slow metronome that had nothing to measure. She swung her legs over the bed and stood before her knees could argue. The old boards underfoot cold enough to turn the heat in her body into a lie. She walked the hallway without turning on a light. She knew the steps and where they creaked. She knew the exact tilt of the frame that held Jessie's kindergarten photo. How it sat crooked because Jessie once bumped it with a plastic dinosaur and giggled at the way the glass rattled. She kept it crooked now. It was proof that something in the house could still be touched by her. The door to Jessie's room was open. It was always open. Heather had started leaving it that way the week after everything happened. And then she forgot the reason why. She moved like someone who had done this every morning and every night for half a year. And she had. She crossed the threshold and stood still. The room had a stale smell, dust and old detergent. The curtains were the same light yellow Jessie had chosen because yellow was good for mornings. The quilt lay smooth. The rabbit with the worn ears sat in the corner of the pillow, button eyes fixed on nothing. 2 crayons were under the little desk. A hair tie waited on the dresser like it was expecting a head to return to. Nothing had moved in 6 months. That was the idea. Freeze the room and maybe time would get confused and bring back the child to where she belonged. Heather felt her chest rise and fall. Not because she asked it to. She put a hand on the doorframe to find something solid. No tears came. There had been a lot of those. And then there had been none. She used to think the absence of tears would mean a kind of strength. It didn't. It only meant the well was dry and the thirst remained. In the hallway behind her, Hank stood. He had learned not to speak when she stood in this doorway. Comfort only seemed to make it worse. He leaned a shoulder against the wall because his back hurt when he stood too long and because he slept wrong now that their bed had turned into a border between the two. His eyes were bloodshot but dry. His knuckles were red from 100 small accidents that came from not caring where your hands landed. They were 2 people who loved an innocent, sweet girl who, one day, Hank and Heather went to her bedroom to find it empty. Nobody saw anything, no witnesses, no neighbors, no cameras. And the news cycle had moved on. The church had sent casseroles, but eventually they stopped, and Hank and Heather stayed. She stepped to the dresser and touched the hair tie. The rubber was stiff. She pictured Jessie fighting her way through a tangle of hair, huffing, saying it hurt, then insisting she'd do it herself and making a worse knot of it. Heather smiled without humor and without sound. She put the hair tie down. She looked at the window to make sure it was locked. She checked the closet, though she had long since stopped expecting it to hold anything but air and plastic bins. Ritual had become a substitute for meaning. When she turned, Hank was still there. He didn't reach for her. He had learned not to do that either. She passed him in the hallway. He watched her walk past and then looked into the room himself. He didn't step in. It felt wrong to cross that line unless you were prepared to be remade on the other side. Downstairs, the sink was full of plates that carried the ghosts of food. A half-eaten apple browned on the cutting board. The trash needed to go out. The calendar on the wall still had a circle around a date from 6 months ago. Jessie's birthday. Someone should have erased it. Neither of them did. Heather sat at the table and picked at the soft edge of a placemat until it frayed like an old nerve. Hank didn't sit. He stared at the counter as if he could speak. He had once been a man who lifted weights before work and carried heavy things for other people. He had been that kind of strong. He had also prayed before meals and believed that words had a weight of their own. There was a spine to him that came from both kinds of strength. After Jessie vanished, he kept it going for a while. Push-ups in the garage, folding hands in a pew in prayer. Then the garage felt wrong and the church felt like a stage set after the play closed. He wasn't quite sure he believed it all anymore. So he stopped going. His shoulders rounded, and his Bible gathered dust next to the mail. Heather used to tell stories that had no point except that she wanted to tell them. She used to drag Hank to the farmer's market and bargain for tomatoes with a laugh like a bell. She had always been the one to make other people feel like the world was easier than it was. That person was gone. The replacement was quiet and sharp and did not trust daylight. She kept conversations short because long ones had space for hope, and hope had started to feel like a form of cruelty. The house. The house was a machine that had lost power. The rooms were dim because no one raised the blinds. No one opened the curtains. The TV talked to itself in another room most afternoons. Sometimes Hank slept there, sometimes Heather did. They moved around each other like tenants who didn't want to break a lease they couldn't afford. They ate at different times. They washed their clothes in different loads. They went to bed at different hours, and when they were there at the same time, lay back to back with a strip of cloth of cold sheet between them like it belonged to no one. A day came when Heather said, without looking up from a mug of tea she wasn't even drinking, that they should go back to the police. Not ask for hope, just ask for noise. New flyers, a press mention, a reminder that Jessie's name meant something other than a past tense. "What's the point?" Hank said. She stared at him, as if hearing that sentence for the first time in anyone's mouth. "What?" They looked. They did their best. "That was 6 months ago." "They did their best," he repeated. "You gave up," she said. Her voice had 2 notes in it, anger and fear. He turned his face toward her and away again. "Don't." "You gave up on her. On me." "You were supposed to be watching her that night." He said it almost under his breath, as if he could slip it past both of them. The crack of palm on cheek was loud in the small kitchen. Heather's hands shook before and after. The look on her face was not of triumph or shock, it was an animal look, cornered and aware it had bitten. Hank didn't look at her. His jaw tensed. He turned to the wall and hit it once with his fist. The sound was dull. The skin over his knuckles split and a small, ordinary pain announced itself in the middle of a larger, less honest one. Silence fell again because it knew its place here. Heather backed away, the chair legs scraping the floor. She went up the stairs in uneven steps and shut the bedroom door with care, like a person handling a sleeping child in the next room. Hank stood with his forehead against the wall and breathed through his mouth until he could stand himself again. There are moments when a life chooses a direction without telling you. Later, when you try to find the hinge, you land on small things. A sentence said with no heat. A slap that didn't need to happen. A man punching a wall instead of falling to the floor. From the outside, it looks like people making choices, but from the inside it feels like being carried. 2 nights passed. Heather didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling until the edges of the room blurred, then got up and went downstairs because lying down felt like surrender. The TV whispered to no one. The streetlights pushed faint silver through the shades. Hank was asleep on the couch, one arm over his eyes, and he snored, a soft, congested sound that filled the room with evidence of life. Heather sat at the old desk by the window and opened her laptop. The glow hit her face and made her look like a stranger. She started with safe words. Grief groups, coping after a missing person. Then she moved because the safe words were a lid. Like bottling something up. She typed things she would not say aloud. Talk to the dead, call a spirit, bring back a child. The search results shifted tone. Respectable links fell away. Pop-ups appeared, and she closed them with quick, tight movements of the mouse. She told herself she would stop at the first sign of absurdity, and then moved past 5 of those. She was looking for something that didn't need her to believe in it, only to want it enough. She reached a forum post on a site that looked like no one had paid for it in years. They spoke about a being whose name was written with 3 different ways, and then finally with care as the Dealmaker. The binder of lost threads, the giver of desires. A title that sounded like a job in a sentence. The post didn't describe a face, it described what happened when he listened. People said he could return what had been taken. And people said that if he answered once, he never answered again. People said nothing at all after their first post. Heather wrote the name on a piece of printer paper and looked at it as if it might react. She copied the symbols another user had posted as if drawing them might teach her how they worked. She read what little ritual there was. A circle, a set of candles. The name spoken not as a cry but as a plea. There were warnings. There were always warnings. She read them the way a person reads the side effects of a prescription they already took. She printed what she could and saved what she couldn't. The printer whirred in the quiet and made the house feel awake for the first time in weeks. She cleared the rug in the den and sketched a circle with chalk, careful and precise, because precision feels like control when you have nothing left in the world. The candles were the ones from the last storm because they were all she had. She set them around the circle points like numbers on a clock. It was almost 3 in the morning when Hank walked to the doorway, blinking at the light. He saw her on the floor with papers spread like a map around her. The air smelled like old wax. He had the look of a man who had woken into a life he did not choose and was now being asked to assent to it again. Hank looked up and froze. She had made a script in her head for this moment. He would shout, he would call her crazy. He would finally prove that he had given up on her as well as Jessie. She would throw the candles into the trash and pretend the circle of chalk was a mess she hadn't cleaned up yet. That was how the scene went in her head. Hank stepped closer. He reached down and picked up one of the printed pages. He squinted at the words. His lips moved as he read a line. He swallowed. He looked at her, and the look was not of anger and not pity. It was a recognition of the hole they both stood at the edge of. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked. She didn't answer. There was no answer that didn't risk something. He lowered himself to the floor with a soft grunt and sat next to her, knees bent, the way they used to sit on the floor with Jesse between them, building towers that were always going to fall. He picked up one of the candles that had burned down low and relit it from the stove. He set it back with care, aligning it with a line she had drawn as if he were measuring with his eye. "If it brings her back, I don't care what it is." He didn't say he believed. He didn't say he didn't. He made an oath that had no God in it, only a goal. Heather's shoulders lowered 1 inch. She pressed a thumb into the chalk and left a smudge on her palm. She imagined it as a mark and then scolded herself for being dramatic. Drama is what you do to make attention. There was no one to perform for here. There was only the hush of a house that had been waiting for something to happen and finally saw people moving inside of it. They didn't touch. They sat with their shoulders almost, but not quite meeting. They both looked at the same empty space and tried to make an agreement with it. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator clicked on. A dog barked somewhere far down the block. The ordinary continued without shame. "Ready," Heather said. Hank nodded. They stepped into the circle and Heather lit the wicks. The flames stood still. She spoke the name once, level and plain. "The deal maker." The air tightened. The hairs rose on their arms. She said it again and the temperature dropped. A taste of metal reached the back of her tongue. The third time she spoke it, a sulfur sting crept into the room. The flames leaned inward, then steadied. The man stood at the far edge of the circle. There had been no movement, and there was a figure, tall, thin, composed, in a well-tailored suit, top hat, and a cane. Skin dark and polished like something that had been through heat and kept its shape. Eyes the color of coals before they flare. Teeth aligned and too many by a fraction. He inclined his head. "Yes? You rang?" Heather swallowed. "Yes." The man regarded them. "Heather and Hank. You asked, I answered." "Can you bring our daughter back?" Heather said. The dealmaker walked the perimeter without crossing the line. Shadows clung to the corners and kept their distance from him. "Well, you want what was taken. Understand this. Nothing comes from nowhere." "She's our daughter." "That is a claim. Claim and duty make a pair. Will I ask a simpler question? For whom do you seek her return? For her? Or for yourselves?" We're the ones still here." "Yes, the living place their need above all else. I do not blame them, I simply note it." His eyes moved between them. "You want the child. You want the life attached to her. You want the house to stop being a museum. You want rest. Pardon without confession. I can move a thread, but I do not remake the cloth. We don't need the past. We need her. If I return, another place will bear the loss. Resources are finite everywhere, you know. Heather did not flinch. Price. There will be a choice. Not a riddle. A fact that stands in front of you. You will know it when it arrives. No one will instruct you, and the choice will mark you. It will say what you are. What kind of choice? The kind you once called impossible. You have already begun to doubt that word. His gaze drifted down the hall towards Jesse's room. Right and wrong are labels. When the act is far, you condemn it. When it is in your hands, you will have to calculate it. We agree. The deal-maker lifted a brow. You agree to an unnamed act and its stain. We agree. Bring her back. The deal-maker studied them as one might study a tool before use. Are you sure, my friend? The price will be hard to bear. They nodded. All right. Our negotiations are at an end. You will see what I have done in time. When the time arrives, take the chance. Don't squander it if you are willing to pay. They nodded. Then be heard. He exhaled. The sulfur cut the air. The shadows collapsed in on themselves, and then he was gone. They stood in the circle, breathing hard. The smell lingered. Heather felt wet on her cheek and wiped at it with irritation until she saw it was a tear. Hank flexed his hand. The split skin had paled but stung. Practical movement grounded them. They blew out the candles. Heather cleaned the circle but left a faint ring. Hank stacked the papers and slid them into a drawer. Sleep came here and there. Every sound felt like a signal. Morning returned, coffee cooled, the day sagged. They tried errands and failed. Heather scrubbed the kitchen as if guests were due. Hank took out the trash early. They stayed in the same room longer than usual, not ready to be alone with the silence. On the TV, old clips played. Jessie with frosting on her nose. Jessie wobbling on a scooter. A pan over a park while Hank's laugh shook the frame. Heather set a hand on Hank's without thinking, then pulled away. He turned his palm and met her halfway, and they held on. What if nothing happens? Then we tried the last thing. Days moved. Heather woke from short sleeps with a taste of metal. She checked Jessie's room and stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold. Hank stood in the garage at night and said small sentences into the dark. Bring her back. Take anything else. I'm here. He didn't name a listener. On the fourth morning, Heather found a black smudge on the bedroom wall near the dresser. She said nothing. On the fifth, a candle in the drawer had bent as if warmed. No one had lit it, and on the sixth, the house held still for a breath longer than it should have and then resumed its normal paces. They noticed, but pretended they didn't. On the 10th day, ordinary life laid out its usual list and they ignored it. The mail was late, the neighbor's dog barked at the air, the refrigerator cycled off. Hank checked the deadbolt 3 times and came back to the bedroom. They turned off the lamp and lay still, facing opposite directions. A train sounded far away. The house settled and the night carried them onward. Heather woke to the usual clicks in the vents and the faint hum of the street. She sat up and turned her head and saw a door in the bedroom wall where there had never been one. Wood, hinges, a dark knob. The paint around it matched the wall as if it had always been there. Hank! He came too fast, stopped short, looked from the door to her. You see it? I do. He touched the knob, locked. He tried again, still locked. He pressed his ear to the panel, nothing. He stepped back and threw his shoulder into it and the door stayed. They went through a list. Hinges, pins, pry bar, screwdriver, drill. The screws turned but did not lift. The bit snapped. The wood showed no marks. Heather tried old keys. A card at the latch, a bobby pin. Nothing. They sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, watching it. The room felt smaller. Listen, Heather said. At first, there was only their breathing. A soft patter. A brief giggle, light and quick. Hank flinched. He bent to the keyhole. Darkness. Then a small shadow passed. The height of a child. I saw. I heard, Heather said. They tried again, because trying was the only defense against helplessness at this moment. Tools, pressure, the steady application of will. The door remained. Afternoon light moved across the floor and up the wall. The sound behind the panel came and went. Light steps, a toy skimming wood, a breath of laughter. They ate standing up and came back. They stayed until their legs ached. Evening tightened. They wrapped a blanket over their knees. Near 3 a.m, sleep took them both. Heather woke to a faint click. The knob sat slightly turned, as if it had answered a hand. She stood and put her fingers on it. It moved without resistance. The door opened a hand's width. Cold air slid out. She looked at Hank, slumped in the chair, mouth open. She touched his shoulder and stopped. She went to the door and stepped through. She turned to leave it open, but habit took over. Her hand pushed the edge. The door shut behind her with a soft latch. When she reached back, there was only a wall. Beige paint, a framed print of a tree, a texture a little rougher than their house. Panic rose and eased. She made herself breathe. She was in a hallway that matched theirs in scale and layout. The scuff at ankle height was in the same place, but a different color. Drawings lined the wall. A house, a sun, 3 figures holding hands. Marker strokes and bright colors. She kept her hands at her side so she would not smudge anything. A flex in the air behind her, and then Hank stumbled in, catching himself on the opposite wall. She must have woken when she shut the door. "And don't let it close," she said. They moved toward the room that, in their house, was Jesse's. The door was ajar. Heather pushed it open. The room held a child's life. Same size bed, different quilt, books in a slightly different arrangement. The smell of sleep and shampoo. On the dresser sat a photo in a painted frame. A man, a woman, and the girl between them. One big smiling family. The same exact family that Heather and Hank were 6 months ago. Heather lifted a hand toward the frame and stopped before touching the glass. To see a picture of herself and her husband and her daughter in another person's house, but a house that was theirs. It was too much to handle. A small shift under the quilt. The child faced the door as if turning toward them. The long lashes lay against a familiar cheek, a tiny whistle at the end of a breath. Heather and Hank were thinking the same exact thought. They needed this little girl. They needed their Jessie back. What if they come looking for her? They'll learn to live without her, Heather said. Her mouth went dry. If right and wrong were clean, they would turn away, walk back through a door that might not open again, accept their loss. But they had accepted their loss for 6 months and found no redemption in it. The world had taken their child in the middle of the night in their own house and left them with forms and casseroles. Nothing about this was clean. Heather stepped to the bed until her knees touched the frame. She studied the child's face for anything that would tell her to stop. She found sleep and warmth. She found the steady rhythm of a body that believed it was safe. Hank moved to the far side of the bed. He slid one arm under the child's shoulders and one under her knee and lifted slow and sure. The girl made a sound that settled against his chest. His arms tightened. He didn't look at Heather. He didn't need to, because he already knew the answer. They walked back into the hall. The wall waited, bland and closed, and the door was there. They went through. They walked back into their world, into their bedroom. Hank turned around, and Heather closed the door. After Heather closed it, the latch clicked. The wood lost its edges. The paneled door faded into the wall. A scream rose from the other side, muffled by space, but it still landed. A man shouted. Feet pounded a hall. Drawers opened and shut, and the girl in Hank's arms stirred and rubbed her nose against his shirt, but she did not wake. Heather pressed her palm to the wall until the paint felt warm and then cool again. The sounds came as a series. A cry, a call, the scrape of a door, then blurred into a pressure she could feel through her hand. She took it away. Hank stood with the child held close. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did. He sat on the edge of the bed. He did not yet lay Jessie down. The girl's eyes opened a fraction. She looked up at Hank, then at Heather, a soft smile appearing without effort. "Mommy? Daddy?" she murmured. And her eyes closed and she went back to sleep. Heather swallowed. She couldn't speak. She set her hand on the girl's back and felt the steady rise and fall. She had missed this more than any memory. A presence gathered at the edge of the hallway. No chill, no gust. Just the knowledge that someone else stood there. The dealmaker. Watched them from near the bathroom door. Heather sat beside Hank. The girl's hand curled into Hank's shirt and held. The sounds from the other side slowly began to dull. Not because those parents stopped, but because the worlds were separating. "Is this right?" Hank asked after a long time. "It's what we chose. I couldn't live without her, Hank." He nodded once. He didn't agree or disagree. Heather stood and walked to Jessie's room. There, Jessie's room. The light revealed dust and absence. She switched it off. She returned to the bed and lay on her side facing them. Hank shifted to make space but kept the girl close. Heather reached across and set her hand on his good hand. He turned his palm and threaded his fingers through hers. They held. They fell asleep for a time, and Hank opened his eyes. Heather and Hank looked at each other and found fear still there a bit, but something steadier. Not a hope in what they once knew, but a readiness to carry what they had taken. Jesse blinked awake, saw them, and smiled with the unguarded trust that had wrecked them and rebuilt them in the same hour. Heather smiled back and let it be simple. Hank kissed the top of the girl's head. They would stand up soon and face whatever followed. For now, 3 people occupied one bed. It wasn't justice, it wasn't absolution. It was going to be a truth that they would have to live with. But Hank and Heather were willing to pay the price. The meeting was going poorly. Things were threatening to unwind as the council destabilized into panic and shouting. The demon horde was here. It was the end of all things. Princess Thalia felt herself being swept up in the tide of despair that was starting to overcome the last gathering of elves and men. But her role was to provide an aura of quiet serenity wherever she went. And if that was all she had to offer in these dark times, she would do so now. Unfortunately, her brother, the king of the elves, didn't share her sense of duty. Amidst all the shouting, he leaned over to 2 of his closest advisors and whispered low enough that Thalia herself was likely the only one to hear them. "Gather your most trusted warriors. This alliance is over. We'll retreat behind our walls to enjoy what time we have left while we wait for the end." His words drove a knife into Thalia's heart. She watched as he, the noble king of elves, snuck out of the war council, leaving everyone else to their fates. But for a moment, her serene smile faltered as her eyes threatened to overflow with unwanted tears. But that was when she caught his eyes for the first time. At the other side of the room, a human general met her gaze. He was far too young for the role that had been thrust upon his shoulders more by vacancy and necessity than experience, but his gaze held a steely resolve that helped Thalia find her serenity once more. She smiled and nodded her gratitude to the man who probably had no idea what he'd just done for her. He grinned toothily at her, and she noticed a wicked gleam in his eyes. Thalia continued to watch as he took a deep breath and bellowed over the crowd, drawing everyone's attention as he did so. "Lords, ladies, and fellow generals, all I am hearing are words of the lost and defeated. This is the doom of our times. The end is here. Let us run and hide, buying what little time we may." Thalia wondered if maybe this man had noticed her brother's disgraceful acts and was about to level accusations to remove the blame of the failure of this war from his own shoulders. The princess couldn't even blame him. If this was how he wanted to spend his last days, so be it. However, he seemed far from over with his theatrics. As he swept into the middle of the crowd that parted before his manic energy, he theatrically spit onto the ground. The room was now quiet enough to hear the soft, wet impact. Thalia hid her distaste, even as he spoke up louder than before. "Maybe you're right. Maybe this is the end. But before I die, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity the demons have given us." The room was so quiet now that even Thalia's heartbeat seemed deafeningly loud in her ears. She was wondering the same thing every other person in the room was wondering. What opportunity could this madman mean? He didn't waste the attention, and even stood on a table dramatically, pointing into the distance toward the approaching demonic horde. "In all the time we fought them, The demons have been careful and meticulous, teasing and testing our lines with constant harassment, never standing and fighting unless they had the advantage. They spread out and overwhelmed us with numbers we couldn't hope to match, thinning our ranks as we stretched too thin. Every warrior present knew precisely what the madman meant. Trying to pin down the demon army was like trying to pin down your shadow, and every attempt saw you slowly clawed and bitten from behind. But now, the man unleashed that wild smile of his own in the crowd, and Thalia could feel the tiniest surge of hope from the gathered lords and ladies, and the man drove his point home. But now, for the first time, all of the demonic horde is in one place. All of their champions, lords, and heroes stand before us. They think we're broken, weary, and at our ends. They think to intimidate us with a show of force before butchering us like cattle. They think we have no fight left in us. The look in his eyes was mad and infectious. Thalia could feel the hearts of everyone in the room starting to beat stronger and faster as the tempo and volume of his speech gained traction. To her, the hearts of these warriors sounded like the drums of war as the madman made his final point. But in their arrogance, the demons have made their first two mistakes. They backed us into a corner, and then they gave us a target to strike at. Gather your men. If we must die this day, then let us ride out and meet them like warriors, and let us take the opportunity they've given us to drive a spear into the heart of our enemy. Let us break the horde here and now and then return home as heroes. A wild cheer rose up from the crowd, and man and elf alike ran out to organize this final desperate, insane assault, leaving only Thalia and the mad human general alone. As he approached her, the princess felt her heart beat faster. A thought occurred to her. What would this insane human do to her now that they were alone? But in truth, she didn't care. If he could bring hope to her people in these dark times, he could do whatever he wished with her, and Thalia would consider it a price worth paying. He drew close but stopped just short. His pungent smell was offensive to Thalia's delicate nose, but she could still feel that wild energy radiating off of him in waves. His smile was still feral, but there was something else hidden there that the princess couldn't place. One moment turned to two, then three, and finally the human spoke. I'm not sure how it is with elves, but in human society, when a dashing knight runs off to face down the evils that threaten the land, it's customary for a maiden to bestow a favor to him to give the heroic knight a reason to return. Thalia's mind was a blur. What did this human mean by a favor? Then she recalled seeing pictures of knights in a book in her brother's library. In the images, ladies had given the knights pieces of cloth to wear into battle. Is that what this man was asking for? Some object to remember her by while he fought? It was such a simple thing, so she relented. All right, what would you... And then she was cut off when the man took advantage of her acceptance and leaned in and kissed the elven noble. As he did so, his emotions crashed into her as she felt everything that was hidden behind his words. At his center was a bottomless pit of fear and despair, such that the pathetic fears that had threatened to overwhelm Thalia before paled in comparison. But around that pit swirled a storm of anger, defiance, and determination. And through it all pierced the tiniest ray of hope. It was a mere sliver of a thing, so fine Thalia would have lost track of it if it weren't for the fact that this man's soul clung to it with a fervorous might. The intensity of his emotions shook Thalia deeply, even as the man pulled back and looked at her with the wild smile and insane eyes that she now had the barest understanding of. His expression softened only slightly as he spoke one last time. Now that is a kiss worth living for. Before she could gather her wits, the human was gone, and Thalia found herself mourning the man whose name she'd never learned. Thalia smiled as she watched her husband, King Reinhold, shift uncomfortably on his throne. The poor man had no idea she'd been the king's sister, and after the other lords and nobles deposed her cowardly brother, they'd been overjoyed to learn the mad human who led them to victory in their darkest hour was also interested in the princess whose hand would decide the next king. All he'd known at the time was that he was flushed with his victory and impossible survival, and she was a beautiful maiden. Their celebration was just what one naturally did after such a thing. He'd been the center of many feasts and toasts, but he didn't catch on until too late that one of those had been a wedding feast, and he was the groom of honor. Not that he minded too much. If marriage was the price of the pleasure of Thalia's company, it was a small price to pay. The whole king thing, though, that was a different matter. He'd been every bit as wild and energetic a king as he'd been a general, so much so that his new subjects often affectionately referred to him as the Mad King. He was known for being the first to dive into trouble and the last to walk away from it. He behaved nothing like any sane king they'd ever known, and they loved him for it. Under his rule, the elven and human alliance had gone from a fragile, temporary thing to a mighty country that rivaled any of the older, more pure nations that bordered them. As time passed, there were signs of his aging. As much as Thalia tried to drive them from her mind, his mortality weighed on her. Not that she regretted marrying her Mad King. She just didn't want their brief time together to come to an end. But, try as she might, the signs were slowly becoming harder to ignore. His arms didn't swing as freely when he walked, and his legs sometimes seemed to become heavy. In addition, his posture was becoming slightly stooped, and his arms and legs seemed quick to get sore and stiff. The people listened to and respected their king, but recently, he'd been growing tired of the bureaucracy. Unless he took a direct hand in anything, nothing seemed to get done. That's when he came up with the clever idea he was about to present. Thalia watched her mad husband with pride as he presented an insane idea that only he could have come up with. "Lords, ladies, nobles, and rabble, I come before you with a proposal for the future of our kingdom." There was a cheer from the crowd. Even the elven lords smiled with as much affection as they were capable of, which, according to Reinhold, was none at all. But he trusted Thalia that it was there even if he couldn't discern it. The king continued, "As it stands, our country needs a way to more efficiently make decisions. As evidence of this, during our last rainy season, we took so long deliberating the best way to deal with the floodwaters we almost lost many of our vital crops. And to that end, I propose a new council. It will consist of 7 members, 3 humans and 3 elves, each respectively representing the nobles, the clergy, and the common men and women of their respective races, with the king or queen acting as an arbitrator, and only in the event of a deadlocked vote, possessing the 7th vote." The people were murmuring amongst themselves. This sounded promising so far, but it was missing their king's now familiar odd touch. However, it seemed Reinhold wasn't finished. Getting the people's attention once more, he continued, "However, to keep this from becoming a council of elves versus men, the elven leaders will be voted for by humans, and the human leaders shall be voted upon by elves, encouraging us all to act for the betterment of each other than ourselves." A cheer went up from the crowd as Reinhold waved at his people, though Thalia saw he tucked his right hand behind his back. It was shaking in an odd way she'd noticed it do several times lately. She almost frowned at that, but instead turned and smiled at the crowd, moving closer to her husband as she did so. Thalia was tired. She'd been covering for her husband more and more, but she didn't know how much longer she could keep the problem from the people. They'd brought in the best healers in the country and swore them to secrecy, but every inspection revealed the same thing. His body was mostly healthy. The problem lay in his mind. The symptom Thalia had thought to be simply mortal aging were apparently a prelude to a worsening disease that was slowly robbing her husband of his body and mind. He no longer spoke before large gatherings, and when he did speak, it was common for his voice to turn soft and trail off into incomplete thoughts. Sometimes his feet seemed to freeze to the ground, and he couldn't move, or worse, he'd fall over. The once mighty warrior grew angry and withdrawn as his body slowly betrayed him. His now constantly shaking hand was never any reminder of how far he'd fallen. Despite all that, once in a while, Thalia could see the great man she'd fallen in love with shine through the darkness from time to time. When he spent time with the children, he always smiled and listened to their meandering stories, and was quick with a tale or two upon request. In quiet moments when they were alone, Thalia would place her head against his and listen to his rage and emotions. The sadness and weariness were more profound and louder than ever, but so too burned the same fiery determination he'd wielded against the demons. What's more, there was now a tight band of light connecting his heart to hers that burned all the brighter with each passing day, despite the fear and doubt that now swarmed around him. Still, with the Mad King's retreat from the public light, Thalia was forced more and more to step up in his place. At first, she'd felt utterly lost in the maelstrom of politics and drama that came with the position. But then she'd think of her husband's mad smile and wicked glint he got in his eyes when he was about to do something characteristically bold and crazy. Then she'd dive right in, learning to trust herself and her own strength as she went. All the while, she felt guilty knowing that as she was fighting her own strength, her husband was losing his, as he fought this unwinnable war against his mind and body. Yet, despite all that, when she'd returned home from a long day of politics and negotiations, he'd always greet her with a smile. The smile had lost some of its wildness over the years, but in its own way, that smile signified an inner strength Thalia had still marveled at. It marked another victory in an unwinnable war. She wondered how he always found the strength to fight on, even when defeat was inevitable. But then again, that was how they'd met. Thalia walked in on the maids cleaning up after her husband's latest tantrum. She couldn't bring herself to be angry with him. It wasn't his fault, after all. It was his mind's way of dealing with the fear and confusion of a world that seemed to grow stranger as it faded in the fog of his mind a little more every day. Still, it made her sad to see him in this state. What was worse, what really tore her heart in two, was when he looked into her eyes, and there was no spark of recognition. Most days, she was nothing more than another face in a sea of unknown and forgotten faces. She could feel his struggle as he fought desperately to hold on to his memories. But every day, a little more slipped through his fingers. Right now, he was sitting in his wheeled chair, watching with shame as the maids cleaned up the remnants of the dinner he'd thrown on the floor. He knew he'd done something wrong, but the once mighty warrior couldn't even remember why he lashed out to begin with. The maids dealt with his tantrums with exceptional care and patience. Thalia had handpicked each of them. Every one of them had fathers, brothers, or in the case of one elderly elf maid, a son who'd fought beside and been saved by the mad human king in their darkest hour. Now, They would proudly stand by him during his own. Once the mess was cleaned up, Thalia dismissed the maid to spend a little time with her husband, even if he didn't recognize her any longer. She brought over another bowl of his favorite stew and started to feed him since his badly shaking hand rendered him unable to do so for any longer. Between spoonfuls, she looked up and was startled to see the hint of his old wild smile hinted at on his face. His eyes searched hers desperately, as if trying to remember something of great importance that was long forgotten. For a moment, Thalia's hope flared as she felt his mind tugging at hers. But then the moment passed, and his eyes clouded over as he slumped in his chair. For just an instant, it was too much for her. The queen turned away and hid her eyes from the man she loved out of fear he'd seen something in there that might hurt him further. At that moment, the old king spoke, his voice soft and frail. "Oh, come now. A pretty young lady like yourself must have something better to do than dote on an old, weak man such like me. At your age, life is all about love and adventure. Great things are waiting for you out there. You shouldn't be shut up in a stuffy room like this." Thalia turned and looked into her husband's eyes. There was something there, a flash similar to recognition, though he still didn't seem to know who she was. But what was more important, there seemed to be an essence of his old intelligence. She smiled back at him. "My king, there is nothing greater I could be doing right now, and nowhere I'd rather be than with you." The Mad King smiled sadly but fondly. "You know, you remind me of someone precious I knew so very long ago. It might be hard to believe, but she was every bit as lovely as you. Her eyes could pierce through the thickest of crowds and make you feel like you were alone in the room with her. My Thalia, the love of my life." She felt her tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. It might not have been quite how she would have pictured it, but this was far too rare and precious a moment to waste. So instead, she encouraged him further. "It sounds like you loved her very much. Tell me more about her." Reinhold smiled before speaking. The love and warmth in the expression soothed Thalia's soul. "You know, the first time we met, she saved me. She saved us all, really. This whole kingdom would have fallen to the demons if not for her courage." Thalia felt her heart fall. He was obviously confused again. "My king, as I've heard it, it was you that saved us that day." The frail old man tutted and shook his head as he patted Thalia's hand. "Maybe, but I was only able to do that because she saved me first. There she was, alone in a room full of great and powerful people. All of us were in an utter panic. There was no hope. The end was nigh, and we all knew it. I was ready to retreat with my armies and hide behind a wall to wait for the end to come when I looked across the room and saw her." The king smiled as he looked off into the distance. The current world might be hidden from him by mental fog, but the world of the past remained clear to his eyes at that moment. "I saw a fiery determination not to give in to despair in her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Then, for one moment, that fire dimmed and threatened to go out. I knew then and there that I had to do something, anything to rekindle that fire just a little longer. So I just started shouting whatever harebrained things came to mind that might give her even a sliver of hope. Wouldn't you know it? The things I said for her worked on everyone else too. The whole thing, my speech, my legendary charge, even my own return, I owe to that lone maiden fighting her own fear in the corner of a large room. When the Mad King smiled down at his queen, his smile had every bit as much of the wild edges as it ever held. You know, at first, when we were left alone in that room, just the two of us, I'd planned to go off and die in a suicidal charge to buy my maiden just a little more time. But she held me rooted in place, and I was helpless in her gaze. Thalia's loving husband smiled as she drew closer to him. I don't know who was more surprised by our first kiss, Thalia or myself, but I do know it was that kiss that gave me the unbreakable command that I must return to my princess. I charged into the heart of the horde and faced off against innumerable nightmares, enraptured by that one incredible life-changing kiss. Thalia tightly hugged the lover of her life once again. As she clung to him, all fear and doubt were silenced. In its place was a pure love that calmed her soul and soothed her fears. For one impossibly long moment, she felt every ounce of love and devotion this man had ever felt pour into her soul. There was more beautiful, raw emotion in that moment than she'd feel in 1,000 years. Then the moment passed, and Thalia opened her eyes to stare into the face of her beloved. He smiled. There you are. I've been looking for you. There's so much I need to tell you about. Thalia hugged him tightly as she whispered to the man she'd given her life to. Of course, my king. Tell me whatever you like. I want to know everything. Thalia hugged her great-granddaughter as they sat under the old oak tree behind the castle. This was her favorite place to rest these days. The tree was one she'd planted to mark her husband's grave so very long ago, and in its shade, she could almost feel him reaching through the ages to hold her close once again. She was surrounded by family and friends, and finally enjoying her retirement, having recently given up the role of monarch to her son. When she'd last checked on him, the poor king had been buried in parchment and paperwork as he struggled to undo some political faux pas that had been overinflated in an attempt to gain leverage over the inexperienced ruler. But when she'd looked up and seen the old queen looking in on him, he gave her a smile that echoed his father's wide grin, in such a way that Thalia knew he'd be all right.